truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Friday, June 21st, 2024, the 1,247th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening to the podcast through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You will be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you will be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, you can continue listening to the podcast for free on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so this week we were treated to a very unusual episode, totally unexpected. A summer Instagram romance, a bromance, between Vladimir Putin and Lil Rocket Man, Kim Jong-un, that played out over a number of days in a series of locations, a bunch of different activities with some very unique Instagram backdrops. In the world of online influencers, you would call this a content series. The entire thing was scripted, produced, packaged, and then disseminated in a way that would make the content go viral and communicate a very authentic message to whoever viewed it that would have the ability to break free of all of the narrative manipulations within the central narrative handed down from the authoritative source. We know that Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un are both brutal authoritarian dictators. They are autocrats. They are great threats to America. They are our adversaries and rivals. They can never be trusted. They torture their people. They have nuclear weapons, and the list just goes on and on and on. Well, this week they just looked like a couple of world leaders palling around, taking turns on who's driving, having a nice walk around a park, throwing themselves a parade, and absolutely at no point in the entire series ever wandering off to look at a parachute man or potentially shitting their pants. They did not try to telepathically communicate with the Pope, and they did not fail to dance next to George Floyd's brother and a man in a dress. Now, this being an obvious content series meant to generate some goodwill and some warm feelings about Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, one might wonder if Joe Biden's public appearances for photo ops, like the one in which he wandered off to talk to a parachute man, or the one in which he failed to dance, or the one in which he had to be guided off stage by a clean, articulate black man. At some point, it might be worth questioning, how did all those videos of Joe Biden get out? Aren't all the people around Joe Biden trying their best to protect him from these sorts of incidents? Oh, that's right. Joe Biden is on his delegitimization tour. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un are coming in like a couple of guys that everyone would want to have a beer with. There isn't a normal person in the world who would ever want to sit down and have a conversation with Joe Biden over beers. No matter how you try to start a conversation, he'll just say something like, "You're too old for me, Jack," and then run off and find someone to sniff. So it took nothing more than a social media content series to completely obliterate the public sentiment and long-held view of Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. Isn't that incredible? It's been a decades-long battle of narratives, and it seems that Putin and Lil Kim have prevailed. What does that say about the people rolling out and disseminating the central narrative? What does it say about their level of perceived honesty? It says no one's buying any of it, and in truth, they never did. Their views clearly were not deeply held. They would express them on command based on social incentives and punishments, but they didn't actually believe them. And as soon as the information stream changes and the incentive structure changes, they change their belief immediately. And of course, this is something I've been talking about for years. And yes, this is how this process will continue to go. It's unfortunate that it has to be one issue at a time, one story at a time, rerun after rerun after rerun until it finally breaks. But when it breaks, it's broken and it's not going to be repaired. There's not going to be some way that the regime is going to convince everybody, oh yeah, Putin and Kim are the problems. It's not the people who have been lying about them for decades and decades, we now realize. It's not the people who are trying to start wars with them all the time or using them as boogeymen in order to get us to comply. It's Putin and Kim. They're still the problem. The narrative is broken beyond repair. Once that happens, the incentive and punishment structure flip because the social cues aren't what they once were. If you're still out there saying Putin and Kim are evil, you look like a warmonger, a globalist, and a fool. You look like the sort of person who's been supporting this regime for decade after decade after decade in their quest to subjugate the world. And so the things that you used to say for social credits, oh yeah, Putin, did you know that he was a KGB agent? Oh, wow. I can see you've really done your homework. Lil Kim can shoot nukes that'll reach California. Okay, I get it. I saw that article too. Everyone you might say that to used to agree. And if someone didn't, it was relatively easy to shun and marginalize that person. It was a protected viewpoint. You could say it, everyone would agree, and everyone would get the feeling of, hey, we're all smart. We all know what we're talking about on this. No one could argue any of those points besides relying on other official slogans, but everyone always assumes that everyone else must know, and that is how they all agree, so it just keeps working. Until one day it doesn't. And we have absolutely unquestionably reached that day when it comes to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. And again, keep in mind, this is kind of the end stage of a long process. You'll remember Kim Jong-un with Dennis Rodman, Kim's sister attending the Olympics, Donald Trump bringing North Korea and South Korea together across the demilitarized zone. And so after all of those reruns, they're now going viral for their Instagram summer bromance. But let's get the official story from the New York Times as they try to clean all this up. Putin and Kim sign pact pledging mutual support against, quote, aggression. President Vladimir Putin of Russia and North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un revived a Cold War-era mutual defense pledge between their nations on Wednesday as the Kremlin deepened its security relationship with North Korea and vowed solidarity in challenging the United States. And you might as well read the United States in quotes there. Their problem is not with the people of the United States, and it's not with Donald Trump or the MAGA movement. Their problem is with the global evil twin currently represented as the Uniparty in the United States. Neither Russia nor North Korea immediately released the text of the new treaty, but Mr. Putin, speaking at a joint briefing in Pyongyang after the two leaders signed the document, said the pact called for the nations to aid one another in the event of aggression against either country. Mr. Kim claimed the new treaty elevated the two countries' relations to an alliance. So if North Korea is attacked, then Russia, as its ally, now has a formal obligation to respond in defense of North Korea. And the reverse is true as well. How will that apply to the very real war that is still happening in a very real place called Ukraine? I guess we'll have to see. By the way, just a brief aside, Donald Trump was on the All In podcast yesterday, or maybe the day before. It's with David Sachs and these three other guys who are apparently billionaires. They are all normies. The least normie one, I think his name is Chamath Palihapitiya. I hope I'm saying that correctly. But the other three are just totally clueless about anything that is happening outside of the central narrative. Now, that said, they did manage to bring up some interesting issues, and Trump gave some really interesting responses. He also seemed particularly comfortable talking to other fellow business people. It's like their mind works in a certain way, and Trump most easily communicates with minds that work that way. So one of the guys who I'm not familiar with asks Trump a question about taxes and tariffs, whether it's possible to begin charging tariffs while eliminating taxes. And Trump frames his answer around countries moving away from doing trade in the dollar. And I'll play about a minute of this, but listen toward the end what Trump says about Ukraine.
I happen to be a big believer in tariffs because I think tariffs give you two things. They give you economic gain, but they also give you political gain. If a country is out of control on something having nothing to do with economics or having nothing to do with money coming in or money going out, but other things that are very political, because there are a lot of other things involved in countries, you have tremendous power over a country. Now, not everybody can say that, but we can because we're the big piggy bank. But our piggy bank is going to get smaller and smaller all the time because we're losing power. We're losing a lot of, countries on the dollar. I mean, they're going like flies. If we ever lose that, that's the equivalent of losing a war. That would be unbelievable. That would really make us third world. We have lost so many countries. I looked the other day. So Russia's gone. you take a look. Ukraine doesn't sort of exist in a sense. Nobody knows what's going on there. But when you look at China is essentially gone. They're trying to get out of it. They're a primary competitor. Iran is not there. The other day I read where Saudi Arabia is willing to now go in various different currencies instead of the dollar. This is a tragedy. This is a big thing that's happening against our country, and we cannot let that happen.
Now, he's talking about those nations extracting themselves from the control mechanism of the global regime's fiat currency system. And he mentions that Russia's extracted itself, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and he can keep going down that list. But those are some of the most powerful countries in the world, and the global regime has lost their control mechanism over those countries. But when he mentions Ukraine, he doesn't say Ukraine is gone. He said Ukraine doesn't exist in some sense. And as we've been talking about for well over 2 years, is it well over 3 years at this point? I don't even know. But the pattern is that the lines on the maps drawn by the UN and the League of Nations before that, and the people in control of nations well before that, the lines on the maps that have been protected by the global regime's police force, which is the United States military, now for well over a century, are being erased. Those lines don't matter to those regional powers as the multipolar world emerges, and the global regime does not have any means of keeping those quote-unquote countries, really just territories, under their control. The United States military is not defending their proxy states and helping them preserve their control over them. We see it happening in Africa. We see it happening in South America and Southeast Asia. It's not any different when it happens in Ukraine or Israel or Taiwan or Hong Kong before that. He's saying Ukraine doesn't exist because for all intents and purposes, it doesn't exist. Some agreement will be reached about what happens with that territory, but the eastern 30% plus is already just Russia now. Crimea has been Russia for 10 years. There are different ideas about how the rest of that territory would be divided up. Maybe the global regime will be allowed to keep Kyiv or something, but probably not. Why would anyone let them do that? Regardless, that's the pattern we're dealing with. All of the overreach of the global regime is being reversed. We need to do it here in this country, which means going all the way back through our history and unwinding it, just as it's being done on the world stage by these various regional powers, all of whom are joining BRICS, while absolutely no one is joining the global regime side. They occasionally try to scrape off some small European nation, and even that fails. But let's return to the summer bromance. Just before the break, we learned that Putin and Kim had formed a mutual defense alliance. Now, over the last few years, we've heard, Ukraine is going to join the European Union. Ukraine is going to join NATO. And if Ukraine joins NATO and Russia attacks Ukraine, then that means the United States needs to get into the war, man, because that's what Article 5 says. Sure, that treaty was agreed upon before most of the world's population was alive. But we all have to agree to defend the words those global commies put on that page, even if it means our lives. We were actually told within the last couple of years that a couple of stray Ukrainian rockets that landed, reportedly, in Poland, killing, reportedly, 2 Polish people, were Russian rockets, which meant that Article 5 had been triggered and that the U.S. had to go to war. That's just what it means to have this very official alliance. Well, here's the thing. Now North Korea has one of those with Russia. So the strongest country in the world militarily, it seems, is now defending that little nuclear power North Korea, and North Korea has China right next door as well, who also seem to get along pretty well with Russia. And then you've got India as a South Asian regional power. And they're part of BRICS, so you can't imagine that India's going to go against Russia and China. That wouldn't make sense. So really, as of right now, North Korea has a stronger defense alliance than Luxembourg does with all of NATO. Just one brief fling of a summer bromance, and all of a sudden you're stronger than NATO. Mr. Putin did not say whether the new agreement would require immediate and full-fledged military intervention in the event of an attack, as the now defunct 1961 treaty between Moscow and Pyongyang specified during the days of the Cold War, so not quite Article 5. The pledge of mutual assistance is likely to further alarm Washington and its allies. It could presage not only deeper support by North Korea for Russia's war in Ukraine, but also greater support from Moscow in aiding Mr. Kim's quest for better functioning nuclear weapons, missiles, submarines, and satellites. A development that would increase anxiety among America's Asian allies, especially South Korea. Yeah, we're probably going to protect South Korea even harder than we protected Ukraine. It's going to happen. I just know it. And we're also really going to protect Taiwan super duper hard. And apologies for once again diverting, but let's hear from Donald Trump really quickly because he talked about China-Taiwan the other day on this Billionaire Normie podcast.
On the relationship with China, it's funny how Democrats and Republicans seem to have a unified voice and banging the drums on the rise of China. Do you think that war with China is inevitable? And if not, how do we avoid it?
I think it's not inevitable. I think it's unlikely. I know President Xi very well, and we got along great until COVID. Then I wasn't so happy with him because they gave it to us. I said it came from the Wuhan lab. I was right about that. They said then it started in Italy, and then it started in France. It started everywhere but there, but it started in China. And it was many, many millions of people died all over the world and cost the world probably $60 trillion, which is more money than China has and more money than anybody has. The death and destruction has been unbelievable. But I think it's high. If you have the right president, we can live at peace with China. We can do very well with China, compete with China. But we don't have the right president right now. He's not respected by China. He's being laughed at by China. And he's a Manchurian candidate. I mean, he's received money from China, his family. And that makes him, to me, somebody that shouldn't be negotiating. I think he's got a conflict of interest. But no, I don't see war with China as being inevitable at all.
And of course it's not. There would be no reason for us to go to war with China to defend Taiwan, which is part of China. We would legitimately be defending the enemy. It would make no sense. Now, I'm not saying that Taiwan is the enemy. Not saying that the Taiwanese people are the enemy, obviously. Saying that the global regime is the enemy. We would not go to war with a sovereign nation to protect the global regime's proxy state. In fact, the global regime's grip on that proxy state and their abuses of the people of that proxy state would be the reason why they would be removed from the proxy state in the first place, just like in Ukraine. But back to the bromance and back to the New York Times. Both leaders heralded the agreement as the beginning of a new era in their relations. Mr. Putin, speaking on his first trip to North Korea in nearly a quarter century, cast possible Russian military support for Pyongyang as a logical response to the West supplying weapons to Ukraine, which he claimed violated various international obligations. And it would be hard to argue that that is not a logical response. Of course it's a logical response. The only way to see it otherwise is to believe that we are all on the side of the global regime and that by virtue of being part of the global regime, we claim the right to control the entire world and bend every other nation to our will. That is the perspective of the global regime, and members of the Uniparty who carry out the mission of the global regime to implement its agenda here in the United States support that ideology. They call it spreading democracy around the world. The neocons do it through war. The neoliberals do it through financial corruption and cultural subversion. And the libertarians do it through free trade. The result, of course, is global communism. Russia, quoting Putin, does not exclude the development of military technical cooperation with North Korea. He threatened, according to the New York Times, to support the ambitions of a military that the United Nations, backed by Russia, has been trying to defang for years. Whoops. Any transfer of arms or military technology to or from North Korea is prohibited by UN sanctions that Russia blessed. Mr. Putin, however, said on Wednesday that it was time to review those sanctions, calling, quote, the very practice of sanctions strangulation and a tool of Western hegemony. And of course, sanctions are the very financial manipulation we just discussed from the global regime's fiat banking system. That system has been weakened to the point they have lost control, to the point where these countries no longer care. They don't need the global regime's fiat bankers. They have moved beyond it. The fiat bankers have traditionally had the U.S. military to go in and bomb whoever attempts this. Now that doesn't work anymore. Is that because Joe Biden doesn't want to do it, or because Joe Biden's not a legitimate president? Pyongyang has the right to take reasonable measures to strengthen its own defense capability, ensure national security, and protect sovereignty, the Russian leader added. His remarks appeared to come dangerously close to helping Mr. Kim obtain what he has long coveted, and the West has vehemently opposed: acceptance of North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. What does that mean? Accepting them emotionally? Oh, right. I forget that the people designing the global regime's operation are spoiled and petulant teenagers who think that they can make countries do what they want just by ganging up and bullying those countries. If North Korea is going to have nuclear weapons, you guys are not allowed to be friends with North Korea. And for real, it's entirely possible that we have now reached the rom-com portion of this process. I have talked for years now about how the awakening kind of operates like spending a day in a movie theater watching one movie after the next, and it changes genre each time. It starts as a horror movie, and at times it's an action movie. And as you get closer to the end, it becomes a dark comedy, and then finally a romantic comedy. And I think that is exactly where we are. It's like every 80s and 90s movie where the awkward girl who was bullied by all of the popular mean girls ends up getting asked to the prom by the quarterback and ends up becoming prom queen, making all of the popular mean girls very, very jealous. This is exactly the same. Indeed, the pact announced Wednesday marked a dramatic change in tone for Mr. Putin since the days before his full-fledged standoff with the West, when he called Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions unacceptable and cooperated in international efforts to stop North Korea from developing nuclear and missile technology. I don't think he'll ever sign up to that again, said Michael McFaul, a former U.S. ambassador to Russia and director of Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, referring to Mr. Putin. I think he's decided we're the enemy. The liberal international order that the United States anchors is over, and he wants to see its destruction. Well, yes, Michael McFaul, you global communist, that is exactly what we want. It is what the world wants. The people have woken up and decided that they do not want to participate in your system because the results are atrocities, and we've gotten enough cheap shit on Amazon. The prospect of Moscow possibly sharing its deep knowledge of satellites, missiles, and space with North Korea underscored how Mr. Putin, in his 24 years in power, has evolved from a supportive, if difficult, interlocutor for the West to its chief global antagonist. North Korea has dozens of nuclear warheads, but has had technical problems perfecting the missiles that can carry them. Oh, I'm sure that's true. The new agreement was one of the most visible rewards Mr. Kim has extracted from Moscow in return for the dozens of ballistic missiles and over 11,000 shipping containers of munitions that Washington has said North Korea provided in recent months to meet Mr. Putin's urgent needs on the battlefield in Ukraine. Okay, so let's be clear that that claim about North Korea providing all that materiel is substantiated only on the basis of trust for what the uniparty class in Washington says. The Kim-Putin agreement is an unprecedented case of a United Nations Security Council permanent member with nuclear weapons not only accepting but also pledging to defend a regime that blatantly violates security resolutions and international non-proliferation norms, said Leif Eric Easley, a professor of international studies at Ua Women's University in Seoul. And if Leif Eric isn't right about that, well, I don't know what to say. We've heard from an expert. We better trust him. But Mr. Easley doubted that the agreement would make Russia and North Korea formal military allies, as Mr. Kim claimed, saying they lacked the shared institutions and interdependence that give other alliances credibility. These people are so confused. They think that countries who don't approve what they want to do with the quote-unquote international community don't have permission to do what they want to do, when they absolutely do. They don't need the approval of the international community. It all looks so ridiculous now. American officials on Wednesday warned of the danger of closer ties between Pyongyang and Moscow. This should concern any country that cares about maintaining peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, abiding by UN Security Council resolutions, and supporting the people of Ukraine as they defend their freedom and independence against Russia's brutal invasion. A National Security Council spokesperson said, "I have been calling it Putin's very brutal invasion for 2.5 years now, making fun of that phrase in the same way I do with the very violent insurrection and formerly Twitter." They still say it. They still say it. It's unbelievable to me that they are still trying to frame this as Putin's very brutal invasion. The framing from this NSC spokesperson is that this development should concern countries who believe all that stuff. Well, okay, be concerned. What about all the countries who don't believe that stuff? Should they be concerned? And the answer is no, of course not. So really, it's only the countries who have committed to the global regime's agenda and who get their legitimacy from the global regime and its enforcement mechanisms. They should be concerned. And yes, they should be concerned because their system is collapsing before their eyes. The enforcement mechanisms are going away. That means that their incentive structure goes away because once their legitimacy evaporates, the people simply remove them. The events on Wednesday represented the farthest the Kremlin has gone in throwing its weight behind North Korea, a function of both battlefield necessity and a standoff with the United States that Mr. Putin has pursued around the world. The United States is in a standoff with Russia? What are they talking about? Are we at war with Russia in Ukraine? I was told that we were at everything but war. And then what does it mean that Russian and American troops are palling around at bases in Chad and Niger and palling around outside Cuba? I thought they were just hell-bent on destroying each other in this very real war. At the news briefing, Mr. Putin denounced the United States for expanding military infrastructure in the region and holding drills with South Korea and Japan. He rejected what he calls attempts to blame the deteriorating security situation on North Korea, which has carried out 6 nuclear test explosions since 2006 and tested intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach the United States. Mr. Kim called the pact the most powerful treaty ever signed between North Korea and Russia, and praised the outstanding foresight of Mr. Putin, quote, "the dearest friend of the Korean people." And Putin was greeted as esteemed royalty. Russian flags everywhere, massive pictures of Vladimir Putin right next to massive pictures of Kim Jong-un. Compare that to when Mohammed bin Salman was forced to invite Joe Biden to Saudi Arabia and gave him a little fist bump. He basically called Biden an Uber so that he could get to his hotel and left it at that. Why isn't the American president greeted like the Russian president was greeted by North Korea? And oh yeah, it's because Joe Biden's not a real president. Donald Trump had no problem receiving those greetings from powerful world leaders. What is wrong with Joe Biden, the very real president who definitely received 81 million real lawful American votes and carries the mandate of the people, surely as recognized by all of these other world leaders who get their geopolitical analysis from whatever CNN says? CNN says Joe Biden received 81 million real lawful American votes. Well, by golly, Russia and China and India and Brazil, leaders of all these countries who have their own intelligence agencies, they're going to take the American media's word for it. 81 million real lawful American votes. A very, very real president. Mr. Putin's remarks recalled the 1961 Treaty of Friendship and Mutual Assistance between Pyongyang and Moscow, under which the two countries were obliged to immediately extend military and other assistance with all means at their disposal, should one of them find itself at war. That treaty became defunct after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. When Moscow and Pyongyang signed a friendship agreement in 2000, it lacked a clause on automatic military intervention, calling only for mutual contact if a security emergency were to arise. It did not stipulate military intervention or military aid. And so you might be led reasonably to assume that this grand visual display and the viral content series of the summer bromance was specifically deployed to let the world know that if anyone tries threatening North Korea and takes action against North Korea, they are going to have Russia to answer to. Now, why does that make sense? Well, because it causes narrative disruption if the regime's propaganda media attempts to saber rattle to the point where we might believe that a nuclear attack, say, from North Korea was imminent and the U.S. decided to strike first. Now, I'm not saying that would happen. I'm saying that the narrative would be deployed. Now, if that narrative is deployed that we should strike North Korea first, it is clear to everyone who saw the viral content series that Russia would have their backs. Even normies can figure this out from having watched the last 2.5 years of the Ukraine series. Mr. Putin is the first major head of state to visit North Korea since the pandemic, and Mr. Kim gave the Russian leader a red carpet welcome. His energy-starved government flooded downtown Pyongyang with bright lights as the two leaders were driven in the same car. The Russian-made Oris limousine that Mr. Putin gave Mr. Kim last year to the state guest house. Despite sweltering heat, huge crowds were mobilized to a welcoming ceremony for Mr. Putin in the main square of Pyongyang later Wednesday, complete with goose-stepping honor guards and colorful balloons released into the air. The crowds waved paper flowers and the national flags of the two nations as Mr. Putin arrived. And so, do you see the manipulation in the language? Crowds were mobilized. That means the people did not want to go on their own. No, we are conditioned to believe that the North Korean people have no agency whatsoever. Who told us that? The people trying to permanently end human liberty through a digital technocratic system of inescapable control dominated by social credit scores, digital medical records, and a central bank digital currency. Not to mention electric cars, smart cities, and the 15-minute city agenda. And naturally, don't forget about censorship. But the North Korean people, no agency. Also, their soldiers, they're goose steppers, just like Nazis. You can tell how evil they are just by the way the New York Times describes them. At the outset of the talks, Mr. Putin thanked Mr. Kim for his consistent and unwavering support for Russia over Ukraine in light of the, quote, hegemonic and imperialist policy of the United States and its satellites. Months before Mr. Putin's trip, Moscow used its veto power at the UN Security Council to disband a panel of UN experts that helped to enforce sanctions aimed at making it more difficult for North Korea to develop its nuclear arsenal. Russia had vetoed resolutions about cross-border access to Syria and sanctions extensions on officials in Mali, demonstrating its ability to play spoiler to U.S. interests around the globe. Now, to be clear, sanctions are financial warfare waged against the people of nations that the UN wants to bring under control of the global regime. Obviously, moving away from the global regime's financial system and opening up trade routes that don't depend on the American dollar make those sanctions obsolete and ineffective. That becomes especially true when a country with veto power happens to be a country that just had that sort of financial warfare waged against it by the global regime within the last few years and truthfully for decades prior. Throughout the visit, Mr. Putin characterized the two nations as kindred spirits, managing to persevere despite Western attempts to punish them and hold them down. After holding closed-door negotiations and signing the new agreement, Mr. Putin went for a stroll with Mr. Kim outside, placed a wreath at a monument commemorating the Soviet liberation of Korea at the end of World War II, and gave a toast to their friendship at an evening banquet. Russian state news reported that Mr. Putin gifted the North Korean leader another Russian-made limousine during the trip. On Wednesday evening, the Russian president hugged Mr. Kim, promising to stay in touch, and flew to Vietnam, which has a long history of ties to Moscow, but has developed warm relations with the United States, now one of its top trading partners. North Korea's military has long been ridiculed for its backward technologies and vast stockpile of outdated Soviet-era weaponry, such as artillery shells. But Mr. Putin's embrace of Pyongyang demonstrated how such old-fashioned munitions are among those that Russia most desperately needs in its war of attrition in Ukraine. Oh yeah, Russia is totally desperate for outdated Soviet weaponry. Ukraine is so strong and has taken such an advantageous position. It is such a war of attrition that Russia needs its old weapons back from Ukraine. It is amazing that any of their readers believe this. How far Mr. Putin can take his support of North Korea will depend in large part on China, which has become a lifeline for Russia since his invasion of Ukraine. Beijing may be wary of the Russian leader developing too close a relationship with Mr. Kim. China can be a limiting factor, and it will share with the Russians how far they are comfortable with the relationship deepening between Moscow and Pyongyang, said Alexander Gabuev, director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. But at the end of the day, I don't see that Beijing is so uncomfortable with that. Oh, so they might be upset, but they're not upset, but they might be. I get it. That's what happens when Jenny totally thought she was going to be Trevor's prom date. Except then Jenny remembers that being popular doesn't matter at all if you have to be mean, and she befriends Rebecca. In fact, she helps Rebecca do her hair and makeup for the prom and helps her choose a dress, so that when Rebecca becomes prom king, no one is happier than Jenny. No one, except for maybe Trevor. But let's continue. This is from Reuters, yesterday, June 20th. Putin says Russia may deliver weapons to North Korea. Now, the headline has been changed. The original headline is Putin says Russia is considering changing its nuclear doctrine. But apparently that was too provocative or didn't send the right message to people who will only read the headline, so the headline has been changed. It still has the original URL with that original headline. And I won't go through the whole thing, but the treaty signed by Putin and Kim on Wednesday commits each side to provide immediate military assistance to the other in the event of armed aggression against either one of them. Putin said Moscow expected that its cooperation with North Korea would serve as a deterrent to the West, but that there was no need to use North Korean soldiers for the war in Ukraine. Regarding the possibility of somehow using each other's capabilities in the conflict in Ukraine, we are not asking anyone for this. No one has offered us this. Therefore, there is no need, Putin said. And the article reiterates, the United States and Ukraine say North Korea has already provided Russia with significant quantities of artillery shells and ballistic missiles, which Moscow and Pyongyang deny. So we just have to take the evil twins' word for it. Putin said South Korea would be making a quote-unquote big mistake if it decided to supply arms to Ukraine, and that Moscow would respond to such a move in a way that would be painful for Seoul. He was speaking after South Korean news agency Yonhap said Seoul would review the possibility of supplying weapons to Ukraine in light of the Mutual Defense Pact signed by Putin and Kim a day earlier. Now that is insane for a small country like South Korea, with North Korea at its northern border on that island, and China next door, and Russia and India in the region. South Korea is going to begin supplying weapons to Ukraine to try to help the global regime preserve its proxy state there? That would be absolutely nuts. But of course, they can't deal with the optics of this situation, so they have to put this news out there, so it seems as if there's some response. This constitutes zero response. This isn't going to happen in any real way. The narrative might, but this isn't going to happen, so it doesn't actually make any difference. This is an exercise in saving face. Kim Jong-un has been launching shit circles into the sky above South Korea. Their efforts in saving face have been ineffective. Let's continue with Reuters. Putin also expanded on comments he made earlier this month about nuclear weapons, saying Moscow was thinking about possible changes to its doctrine on their use. Putin said this was being driven by changing views on nuclear use among Russia's adversaries. Russia's existing doctrine states that it may use nuclear weapons in response to a nuclear attack, or in the event of a conventional attack that poses an existential threat to the state. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, some hawks among Russian military analysts have been advocating that Moscow should consider revising that stance and even delivering some kind of nuclear strike that might, quote unquote, sober up its adversaries in the West. Who do public war hawks benefit, generally speaking? Well, the people who want war and the media operations supporting that war that can report on comments like that from officials that make it sound as though it is the country or the leader's official stance. Putin told reporters that Russia was thinking about changing its doctrine because its political enemies were working on new elements related to lowering the threshold for nuclear use. In particular, explosive nuclear devices of extremely low power are being developed, and we know that there are ideas floating around in expert circles in the West that such means of destruction could be used, Putin said. There was nothing, quote unquote, particularly terrible about this, according to Putin, but Russia needed to pay attention to it. Since launching his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, something he casts as a special military operation to secure Russia's own security, Putin has frequently spoken about the size and potency of Russia's nuclear arsenal and warned the West that it risks a global conflict if it wades deeper into the war. The article mentions comments Putin made earlier this month. Newsweek reported on those on June 7th, so 2 weeks ago. The Russian state-run news agency RIA Novosti reported that Putin delivered a speech at the recent St. Petersburg International Economic Forum and mentioned Russia's nuclear doctrine. The doctrine is a living instrument, and we are carefully watching what is happening in the world around us and do not rule out making some changes to this doctrine. I don't think that such a case has arisen. He later said, for some reason, the West believes that Russia will never use it. We have a nuclear doctrine. Look what it says. If someone's actions threaten our sovereignty and territorial integrity, we consider it possible for us to use all means at our disposal. This should not be taken lightly, superficially. But let's get back to the summer Instagram bromance between Vladimir Putin and Lil Rocket Man. This is from the Telegraph UK yesterday. Watch. Putin and Kim Jong-un share a laugh on a carpool karaoke drive. The dictators of North Korea and Russia laughed and joked as they paraded around the streets of Pyongyang in a luxury limousine. Up-close footage from inside the car shows. In a setup reminiscent of James Corden's Carpool Karaoke, a relaxed Vladimir Putin drives Kim Jong-un around the North Korean capital as the pair chuckle and exchange stories. The carefully choreographed video footage captured inside the Russian-made Urus car reinforces the strong relationship between Russia and North Korea, whose leaders signed a mutual defense pledge during the state visit on Wednesday. The two men also bonded over animals on the high-profile trip. In one slightly surreal scene, Kim fed a horse carrots while Putin looked on, patting the white animal's head. And that is quite some imagery, especially after just a few weeks ago, we saw a bunch of white horses running bloodied up, somehow, through the streets of London. Both men have repeatedly used horses in propaganda. In an image shared widely online, Putin rode around on a brown horse while shirtless, while an infamous photograph shows Kim atop a white stallion on Mount Paektu. So the Telegraph UK is calling horse comms. The pair also exchanged several gifts, according to state media. Putin offered his North Korean counterpart a tea set, an Admiral's dirk or a dagger, and an Urus limousine, the second car he's given car enthusiast Kim, having sent one to North Korea in defiance of UN sanctions earlier this year. Ooh, a bad boy. He's breaking the rules, knowing that Rebecca does appreciate the finer things in life. Yuri Ushakov, a Kremlin aide, said the tea set was quote-unquote very beautiful, according to Russia's TASS state news agency, adding that Putin also received, quote, very good presents. This included a pair of native Pongsan hunting dogs, the same gift received by Moon Jae-in, the former South Korean president, during a period of friendlier relations in 2018. Friendlier relations? Is that because Donald Trump was president? Wait a second. North Korea and South Korea had friendlier relations while Donald Trump was president, so there was a lower likelihood of war involving those two countries and that border dispute and the state of things regarding their affiliation with the global evil twin. Things are worse off now relative to North and South Korea under the fake president Joe Biden. Gosh, I'm shocked. Footage showed Putin smiling as he watched the white hunting dogs who were tied to a fence adorned with roses. So I think that might be horse comms, dog comms, and rose comms in this article. Now, I want to come back to their little joyride in just a second, but the last part of the content series to complete the summer Instagram bromance episode was Putin and Kim departing on the tarmac, Putin ascending into his plane and then waving through the window at Lil Rocket Man right before he departed. I can't wait to see you again, Trevor mouthed as he closed the door of his dad's 1964 Mustang. I'll never forget this night, or you, Trevor, called Rebecca before heading back into her parents' house to watch scary movies with Jenny until they both fall asleep. But let's talk a little more about the limousine in which they took their little joyride. Someone in my Telegram chat pointed out, so hat tip to 2111, that the license plate reads 7/27/1953. And it turns out that that's the date of the signing of the so-called armistice that is said to have put an end to the Korean War. But this is CNN from December 30th, 2021. Didn't the Korean War end in 1953? The short answer is no. Is the Korean War about to come to an end? Some people might answer, didn't that happen in 1953? Others may know that it was only an armistice that brought the hostilities to a halt in 1953, but there's never been a treaty to end the conflict between North Korea and its chief ally China, and South Korea and its allies, most notably the United States, but more accurately, and this is me speaking, not the CNN article, the global evil twin. Korea was split in half after World War II, with the Soviets occupying the North and the United States occupying the South. It was just Korea before that, with the top South Korean diplomat on Wednesday saying Seoul and Washington have effectively agreed on a draft agreement to end the war. Here's a primer on what that means. And again, this is at the end of 2021. And to be clear, South Korea and the United States can be considered the same entity here, as can the global regime. They have agreed on a draft agreement to end the war. CNN provides a little background from the regime perspective. What was the Korean War? The war broke out on June 25th, 1950, when the first of what the U.S. military estimated as 135,000 North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel dividing North and South Korea in an effort to take control of the Korean peninsula. The United States, under President Harry Truman, responded with what was called a police action, assembling a group of international allies under the auspices of the United Nations Command to come to the aid of South Korea. 22 nations contributed combat troops or medical support units to the U.S.-led effort. Communist-controlled North Korea had the support of both the Soviet Union and China, with Beijing actively intervening on the military front in October 1950, sending almost 250,000 troops into the Korean peninsula as the U.S.-led forces were advancing toward China's border with North Korea. Chinese support of the North pushed the UN advance back down the peninsula, and by 1951, stalemate emerged along the 38th parallel, where the border between the two Koreas sits today. And so the United States was protecting the Korean peninsula from communism. The U.S. was doing that on behalf of the UN, the body that executes the mission, the agenda of the global regime, and supports the implementation of that regime's agenda, which is global communism. So what we have is Korea divided into North and South, Soviets and Chinese allies of the North, the United States in the South. And in order to preserve freedom, all of these elements of the global regime had to come in and preserve regime control over South Korea. It is more or less what's happening in Ukraine right now. How did the fighting stop? Armistice talks began in 1951 and occurred intermittently until a final agreement to end combat was made at Panmunjom on the 38th parallel on July 27, 1953. 7/27/1953. Within 3 days, both sides withdrew their troops to be at least 2 kilometers from the ceasefire line. Why didn't the armistice end the war? The signatories of the July 27, 1953 agreement to end hostilities were the heads of the UN command, the North Korean army, and of Chinese troops on the North Korean peninsula. South Korea is not a signee, and the agreement specifically says it is not a peace treaty. According to the armistice preamble, it is made, quote, in the interest of stopping the Korean conflict with its great toil of suffering and bloodshed on both sides, and with the objective of establishing an armistice which will ensure a complete cessation of hostilities and of all acts of armed force in Korea until a final peaceful settlement is achieved. What has happened since 1953? There was no official contact between the North and South Korean governments until 1971, according to the U.S. State Department. By 1991, though, tensions had eased enough that Pyongyang and Seoul signed on to the North-South Basic Agreement, which said that reunification was the goal of both parties. But a State Department history says the North's budding weapons program and the death of its longtime leader, Kim Il-sung, in 1994, coupled with political turmoil in the South, led to new tensions. The first Inter-Korean summit was held in June 2000, but the thaw it provided ended with North Korea's admission in 2002 that it was pursuing nuclear weapons. That admission led to a series of negotiations about the North's nuclear program among North Korea, China, Russia, South Korea, the U.S., and Japan, known as the Six-Party Talks. North Korea pulled out of that effort in 2009 after restarting its Yongbyon nuclear reactor and launching a series of missile tests. Is this about nuclear energy, or are we actually worried about getting blown up from nukes? In 2007, South Korean President Roh Moo-hyun and North Korean leader Kim Jong-il met in Pyongyang and agreed to try to bring peace and reunify the peninsula without the intervention of outside parties. But conservative Lee Myung-bak was elected South Korean president a few months later and switched to a hard line on the North's weapons program, chilling peace efforts. I wonder if there was any global regime influence on that newly elected South Korean president. Tensions thawed again in 2018 when North Korean leader Kim Jong-un met with South Korean President Moon Jae-in in Panmunjom. The two said they would work to turning the 1953 armistice into a peace treaty. Later that year, the two met again in Pyongyang and signed a joint declaration to pursue denuclearization while working toward peace on the peninsula. 3 meetings between U.S. President Donald Trump and Kim, the first between a sitting U.S. president and a North Korean leader, also failed to make any progress toward denuclearization of the North, despite their historic nature. Efforts have since stalled. You see, they can't end the war because of this denuclearization deal. Trump had it all set up with the leaders of both countries, but that one little piece, it just didn't come through. So now they're still at war. But let's turn to Sputnik International. This is a Russian news site, which means it's state media. They're probably lying about everything, not like our state media, who's always telling the truth. 70 years of uncertain peace, making of the 1953 Korean War ceasefire. Let's just jump all the way down near the end, where the article discusses that 2018 Panmunjom Declaration. Following years of tense standoff that included U.S.-South Korean drills rehearsing a quote-unquote decapitation strike against DPRK leader Kim Jong-un and DPRK tests of a thermonuclear device and an intercontinental ballistic missile, the two Koreas suddenly reached toward rapprochement in early 2018 as South Korea prepared to host the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang that February. The two Koreas entered the stadium as a joint delegation under a flag portraying a reunited Korea, although their athletes competed separately afterward. By April, Kim and then South Korean President Moon Jae-in had not only held peace talks, but signed a joint declaration at Panmunjom for peace, prosperity, and unification. In the document, the two nations committed themselves to denuclearizing the Korean peninsula and to further talks aimed at bringing a formal end to the Korean War. Further talks between Kim and Moon continued through 2018, leading to visits to each other's capital cities, an increase in cultural and economic exchanges, and the repatriation of soldiers' remains, among other friendly actions. The Panmunjom Declaration helped pave the way for further talks between Kim and then U.S. President Donald Trump, first in Singapore and then later in Hanoi, which ultimately fell apart. The U.S. refused to lower its economic sanctions against the DPRK before seeing proof of irreversible and verifiable denuclearization steps, despite the North dynamiting its primary test at Pyongyang and shutting down the nuclear reactor at Yongbyon used to make weapons fuel. Ultimately, the U.S. was unwilling to withdraw from South Korea, and Seoul was unwilling to part with its ally, and the resumption of joint military drills after the collapse of the U.S. DPRK talks significantly cooled inter-Korean relations. The election of Yoon Suk-yeol, a strongly conservative and anti-DPRK politician, in March 2022, essentially spelled the end to the rapprochement. So the prospects of reaching a peace deal ended after an election of an anti-DPRK, regime-friendly candidate in a country that represents part of, quote-unquote, our democracy. And in our democracy, there's nothing anyone cares about more than democracy, which means they always make sure to have legitimate elections, and then the politicians who are legitimately elected obviously enact the will of the people they represent, no matter what the global regime wants. That's what makes it a democracy. If instead the elections aren't legitimate and the leaders just do whatever the people above them in the global regime want, well, then you're just a colony and the people aren't actually voting at all. I'm not sure what's democratic about that, but it's still part of our democracy. And so the reason for these talks breaking down is that the North Koreans just would not give up their very, very real nuclear weapons. Except there's also this from The Guardian in December 21, while the talks were still ongoing. The headline here is, North and South Korea agree in principle on formal end of war. Speaking in Canberra on Monday during his 4-day visit to Australia, Moon said he believed the four main parties agreed in principle to a peace declaration, but he added that North Korea had made an end to U.S. hostility a precondition for talks. Quote, and because of that, we are not able to sit down for a negotiation on the declarations between South and North Korea and those between North Korea and the United States, end quote, he said at a press conference with the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. And we hope that talks will be initiated. We are making efforts toward that. It's worth noting, by the way, that very same Scott Morrison was at Trump Tower last month meeting with Donald Trump. I don't know exactly what to make of that, but it's worth keeping in the back of your mind as a possibility that Scott Morrison is operating as an emissary between Donald Trump and potentially various elements on the Korean Peninsula. Moon said he believed it was important to end the quote-unquote unstable armistice that had been in place for almost 7 decades, adding that a peace declaration could improve the prospects for a breakthrough on Pyongyang's nuclear weapons program. This is going to help us start negotiations for denuclearization and peace on the Korean Peninsula, he said. This is very important on that front as well. Skipping ahead, he repeated his call for a formal end to hostilities during his speech at the UN General Assembly in September, prompting Kim Yo-jong, the influential sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, to describe his initiative as an interesting and good idea. Chinese officials have reportedly voiced support for the proposal, while South Korea and the U.S. are reportedly in the final stages of drawing up a draft declaration. But North Korea has indicated it will not join talks on ending the conflict while the U.S. maintains its hostile stance, a reference to the presence of 28,500 American troops in South Korea and annual U.S.-South Korea military drills that Pyongyang regards as a rehearsal for an invasion. So what made the deal impossible was the global regime's refusal to remove the U.S. military presence from South Korea and end their hostilities, which means the hostile treatment, which means using North Korea as the boogeyman and applying financial sanctions to wage economic warfare against the North Korean people. The global regime was unwilling to do that, so no peace deal was reached. We are told relationships have soured since then, and that's probably because an anti-DPRK president was installed in South Korea. Now, what do we see happening instead? Russia comes to North Korea's aid and says if anyone actually attacks North Korea, they're going to have to answer to us. Now, I don't believe anyone was going to attack North Korea, but now, narratively speaking, everyone understands that Russia is with North Korea. China is with North Korea. And if all of this was happening 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 2 years ago, that might make North Korea sound like an even bigger threat and might make it seem like war is even more likely. But that's not how it seems now. Because of what we've witnessed, narratively speaking, with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and whatever is happening in the Middle East between Israel and Gaza, or Israel and Iran, or Hamas and Hezbollah, and blah, blah, blah. Not to mention the disastrous pullout from Afghanistan. The geopolitical landscape looks totally different, as we can see the obvious incompetence and weakness of the United Nations and NATO, in addition to the total dishonesty with which these narratives are disseminated by the global regime's propaganda state media press outlets. They are preventing peace on purpose to keep North Korea in place as that global boogeyman, the unstable threat to the world run by the authoritarian dictator Lil Rocket Man. Well, now all of that seems preposterous. You cannot watch Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un drive around in a limousine together and trade pets and tea sets and wave to one another from inside and outside the plane as they leave and think these are the greatest threats to world peace. It just doesn't work. It's no longer tenable. And no, it's not about people falling victim to Russian propaganda. The mean girls and the bullies, well, they're no longer the popular ones. In fact, they got punch spilled on their dresses and all went home early to cry. Trevor and Rebecca had a night they'll remember forever, and Jenny was right beside them, clapping along the whole time as they kissed goodnight. And who knows what will become of any of them in the future, but it seems like Rebecca's days of being bullied are over now, because she's in the popular crowd and they changed her name to Becky. We have just seen the chances of a kinetic World War III decreased from a viral social media campaign showing Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un in a summer Instagram bromance. How's that for the power of narratives? I'll be back on Monday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under $0.25 per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree, linktree.com/I'm your moderator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's